They built a language you were never meant to learn, a hidden code still running the world. While the world panicked, the dynasties were already spying. Dynasties encoded their survival into institutions. The code was never meant to be broken. The real decisions travel at 40,000 feet, far above the public world. The forums on television, the real agenda. The real agenda is decided earlier. Technology never disrupted. The dynasties. They funded the platforms first. Dynasties don't think in decades, they think in centuries. They think in centuries. The handshake is older than any contract, and every dynasty honors it. It regulates the regulators, and almost nobody understands its language. The most powerful person in the room rarely speaks. They are studying everyone else in the room. What you read is not what was written. The edit is the encryption. The world's most, once by technology, once by access, encrypted twice. Once by technology, once by access. Some families have hidden information for 800 years because knowledge is the real currency. The most secure meeting leaves. No record, no transcript, no evidence. Secret societies were never myths. They were operating systems. Millions of leaked documents exposed, part of the code, and the world wasn't ready. Some people reach the edge of the code and decide to expose it. Blockchain was designed to fight the system. Then the dynasties bought the infrastructure. Who controls the training data, controls the future of truth itself? You've now seen the architecture behind the system, and the code is only beginning to crack. They built a language you were never meant to learn, a code older than nations, refined across centuries. In 2026, it runs the world, and almost no one knows it exists. The wealthiest families in history didn't survive by accident. They encrypted their power inside language, ritual, and symbol. What they call culture is architecture. What they call tradition is a lock, and you don't have the key. While markets crashed and headlines screamed panic, in the shadow of the crash the dynasties were buying, they knew, they always know, because the language they speak tells them first. This isn't conspiracy, it's architecture. Dynasties encoded their survival into institutions, into bloodlines, into language itself. The code has never been broken until now. 8 billion people live inside a system they didn't design. A handful of families wrote the operating manual. They called it civilization. It was their design. You've been running their code your entire life. Cognitive encryption isn't a metaphor. It's a deliberate system of selective information, what you're allowed to understand and what is withheld. The gap between those two things is where dynasties live. Education was never designed to set you free. It was designed to teach you the publicly approved vocabulary. The real curriculum is invitation only. And the entrance exam started at birth. Their meetings don't happen at conferences you read about. The real decisions travel at 40,000 feet, in rooms where no recording devices exist, in languages only insiders speak. The forums you watch on television are theater. The conversation that matters happens 30 minutes earlier, in the room before the room, where the agenda is already decided. Markets appear chaotic only to those outside the code. To those who hold the cipher, it's entirely predictable. Every crash, every boom, every turning point, written in a language you were never taught to read. Technology didn't disrupt the dynasties. The dynasties funded the silent architecture of our modern world. They encrypted their power into the platforms you use every day. Your data is their vocabulary. The wealthiest addresses in the world have no numbers, no plates, no digital footprint. If you need to search for it, you're not invited. The code handles its own navigation. Dynasties don't think in decades, they think in centuries. Every marriage, every investment, every alliance, written into a multi-generational code. Every symbol encodes the legacy of the bloodline. Central banks print the currency, but dynasties wrote the rules that govern them. The code embedded in monetary policy isn't accidental. It's been running since the first gold coin was minted. Power retreats from public view when it needs to think. The world's most consequential decisions are made in motion, on water, in air, in silence, away from everything you could ever access. The handshake is the oldest encrypted transaction, more binding than any legal document. It transmits code that no court has ever seen, and every dynasty honors. To break it is not just failure, it is exile. There are clubs in this city that have no websites, no waiting lists, no public records of membership. You are either born knowing the door, or you aren't. This is cognitive encryption in its purest form. The Bank for International Settlements answers to no government. It has no depositors, no public shareholders. It exists to regulate the regulators. And its founding documents were written in a language most economists never learned. The most powerful person in any room is rarely speaking. They're encoding, observing the responses to stimuli they've already introduced. The meeting is not a discussion, it is an examination. And you are always the one being tested. The symbols carved into these walls appear in boardrooms today, not as decoration, as instruction. The dynasties preserve the code in stone because stone survives. The message hasn't changed in 4,000 years. 6 corporations control 90% of global media. Each was built with dynasty capital. What you read is not what was written. The edit is the encryption. Knowledge isn't free, it never was. The papers that get funded, the ones that become truth, are selected. What can be known is decided upstream. This is cognitive encryption operating at civilizational scale. The world's most valuable real estate is not bought, it is inherited. Not by blood alone, by code. Knowing which properties exist requires being inside the vocabulary. The rest of the world bids on what's publicly listed. Democracy was the public face, the code ran deeper. The real legislators were never elected. They don't need votes. They fund the campaigns of those who do. The Constitution is the visible layer, the encryption sits beneath it. There are transactions that will never appear in any ledger. No currency, no record, no trail. Value moves between dynasties in a cipher so old it predates writing, and it moves every single day. The rare documents dynasties acquire are not bought for their beauty. They're bought for the information encoded in their margins, for the lineages they prove, for the agreements they record. A single page at auction can shift the balance of generational power. In 2026, cognitive encryption moved into the brain itself. Research into attention, memory, and decision architecture. Funded by dynasties, classified at the highest levels. Because the most valuable territory on Earth is 6 inches behind your eyes. The algorithm is not a machine, it is a policy. Written by people who were trained in the code. What trends, what fades, what you are shown, and what you are not. This is cognitive encryption delivered at 3 billion doses per day. Offshore is not geography, it is architecture. Trust structures designed to disappear from every regulatory map. The assets exist, the ownership does not. Invisible by design, encrypted by law. The world's most sensitive information is encrypted twice. Once by technology, once by access. The second encryption is the one that matters. Not a password, a bloodline. Rome didn't fall, it encrypted itself. Moved its structures into the church, the law, and the bloodlines of European nobility. The empire lives in every institution that traces its origins to the Tiber. They didn't lose, they changed their format. Davos is the visible layer. Journalists cover the agenda, cameras film the speeches. But the real forum meets in hotel suites at midnight and produces no agenda at all. What you see was designed to be seen. Philanthropy is the most elegant form of cognitive encryption. It converts power into gratitude. The hand that feeds writes the policy that governs. Generosity is the oldest code for control. Diplomacy is public ritual. It's a carefully choreographed performance. The agreement was reached 3 months earlier, in a language the cameras weren't present to record. The dinner is the ratification, not the negotiation. The encrypted message arrived before the invitation. You have been watching the surface of the world. Part 1 has shown you the wall. In what follows, we go through it. The city is doubled, inside and outside. The code is about to become readable. Some families have been hiding information for 800 years. Not because it's shameful, because it's valuable. The archive is the vault, knowledge is the currency. And this vault has never been publicly audited. Heraldry is not decoration, it is a data system. Every symbol on a coat of arms encodes alliances, wars, blood debts, and rights. To read it correctly is to understand the entire history of a family's power. The dynasties kept this language alive while letting the public forget it. The children of dynasties are not taught what you were taught. The history they receive names that don't appear in public textbooks. The connections they learn are structural, not chronological. They leave school already speaking the code. Private banking is not about money, it is about memory. A generational relationship with an institution that outlives any individual. The account has no owner, it has a lineage. The bank is the custodian of an encrypted inheritance. The public market is the visible market. There is a second market, darker, faster, accessed through relationships, not platforms. The dynasties move there. They always have. What you trade in is the reflection of what they've already decided. The bill you read is the third draft. The first draft was written in a private office 2 years before the committee formed. The law is the public version of a decision that was made in the code. Legislation is encrypted policy. Policy is encrypted power. A social gathering among dynasties is never social. Every invitation is a test of positioning. Every conversation is an intelligence operation. The laughter is genuine. The information exchange is the point. The Bilderberg meeting has no communique, no press conference, no outcome statement. What happens inside cannot be encrypted because it is never written down. The most secure cipher leaves no material to break. Secret societies are not myths. They are operating systems. They encode behavior, obligation, and alliance in ritual. What appears symbolic is structural. The apron is a contract. The handshake is authentication. 322, a number that means nothing to the public and everything to those inside the code. Members have included senators, directors of the CIA, presidents of the United States. Coincidence is the cover story. Structure is the truth. Art is the most elegant of financial instruments. Portable, appreciating, untaxed across borders when properly structured. But beyond finance, art is signal. What hangs on a dynasty's wall tells insiders everything about their current position. Beneath the cities of Europe lies a shadow economy of frozen value. Art, gold, manuscripts, wine, weapons of historical significance. None of it taxed, none of it public. All of it encrypted into ownership structures that span generations. None of it taxed, none of it public. All of it encrypted into ownership structures that span generations. The monarchy is the most visible form of dynastic encryption. Every ceremony is a transmission. Every piece of regalia encodes centuries of territorial claim. Every piece of regalia encodes centuries of territorial claim. Health is the deepest form of cognitive control. Not just what is approved, but what is researched. The patent system is an encryption engine. It converts knowledge into property. And property belongs to those who funded the question. Energy is not just power. It is the original encryption of political control. The families who controlled oil in 1920 still control the infrastructure today. The names have changed. The ownership structures have not. The code migrated. It didn't expire. The consulting class is the transmission mechanism of dynasty policy. The same firms advise the regulators and the regulated. The same vocabulary appears in government white papers and shareholder reports. This is cognitive encryption deployed as professional consensus. The shell company is the modern dynasty's most elegant instrument. Legally compliant, practically invisible, infinitely layerable. The encryption is not in the technology, it is in the law itself. Because dynasties wrote the law, the most dangerous positions in global finance are held at 3 a.m., not by rogue operators and by architects. The funds that move markets do not participate in them. They own the infrastructure that determines where the market moves. The think tank is where dynasty policy is laundered into expert consensus. The researcher is real, the independence is not. The report is published, the funding is footnoted. Nobody reads footnotes, that is also part of the design. The merger is not a business decision, it is a chess move. Decades of strategic positioning resolved in a single transaction. The buyer knew the target's value before the target understood it themselves, because the buyer had information the code delivered. Sovereign wealth funds are governments investing like dynasties. Some learned the code, some were invited in. The ones that mastered it now own strategic infrastructure in every major city. The landlord of the modern world is not always visible on the lease. 97% of global internet traffic travels through undersea cables. The companies that own those cables were capitalized by dynasty investment. The information infrastructure of the 21st century was not built by startups. It was built on money that has been accumulating since the 15th. It was built on money that has been accumulating since the 15th. 3 companies control 40% of global container shipping. All 3 trace their capital to a common dynasty source. The supply chain is not a neutral infrastructure. It is an encrypted system of toll gates, and the toll has always been paid. Luxury is not about quality, it is about encoding. A logo communicates membership in an aspirational structure the buyer cannot fully enter. The dynasties own the brands. A logo communicates membership in an aspirational structure the buyer cannot fully enter. The dynasties own the brands. They sell the signal, not the product, and you buy the signal every time. The dynasties fund heritage preservation for the same reason they fund archives. not sentiment, inventory. The past is the proof of their claim to the present, and the claim to the present is the foundation of the future. War has always been dynasty business. The weapons manufacturers were capitalized by the same families that financed the governments buying them. The defense budget is the most reliably encrypted revenue stream in human history. Both sides of the transaction belong to the same code. The pharmaceutical dynasty doesn't just own medicines. It owns the question of which medicines get researched. The patent is the encryption key. Without it, the cure cannot exist, even if the knowledge does. Without it, the cure cannot exist, even if the knowledge does. Private equity is the process of making the visible invisible. Public companies are taken private. Names are changed. The business you patronize today may have been acquired by a dynasty holding company yesterday. Your spending is their revenue, and you will never see their accounts. The intelligence community and the dynasty class are not adversaries. The intelligence community and the dynasty class are not adversaries. The intelligence community and the dynasty class evolved together over centuries. The families that capitalized the banks also capitalized the first intelligence operations. The code doesn't stop at national borders, neither did the capital. The contract is the public record of a private agreement. The private agreement was reached through the code. Lawyers do not write the deal, they encode it. What they produce is the legally defensible transmission of a dynasty decision. Healthcare became the ideal dynasty investment when mortality was monetized. You will eventually use it. You have no alternative. The price is set by the owner. The owner is not visible on the intake form. This is cognitive encryption weaponized against biology itself. The dynasties learned to hold food the way they held gold. As a reserve, as leverage, as a language of persuasion. Food security is not a humanitarian concept to those who control the supply chain. It is the most ancient form of political encryption ever invented. The energy transition was not a disruption of dynasty power. It was its next chapter. They sold oil, now they own lithium. The code doesn't care what the resource is, only that it is controlled. The smart city is cognitive encryption made physical. The environment itself becomes the cipher. Every movement logged, every transaction recorded. The revelations continue in part 3. On a Tuesday morning in 2023, 11 million documents left a law firm in Panama. What they contained was not just information about tax evasion, it was a partial map of the code, and the world was not ready for what it saw. Some people reach the edge of the code and choose to transmit it. They understand the price. They proceed anyway. The dynasties call them traitors. History has a different word. The people who've never seen the code can still feel its weight. They march against symptoms, inequality, opacity, the grinding sensation of a system not designed for them. They march against symptoms, inequality, opacity, the grinding sensation of a system not designed for them. The code produces the conditions they are protesting. Every financial crisis is a wealth transfer. The code holders know this because they initiate it. Compression, then acquisition. The dynasties buy at the bottom of every cycle they created. Blockchain was built as a cipher against the code. A ledger no single entity controls. A currency no dynasty can print. For a moment, it worked. Then the dynasties started buying the miners. Investigative journalism is now a covert operation. The reporters who pursue dynasty structures work in the same operational posture as the people they investigate. Encrypted communications, secure drops, anonymous sources. They adopted the code to break it. The law was written by dynasties, but law has a vulnerability. It accumulates. Precedents compound. Judgments create gaps in the code. The lawyers who understand both systems have started exploiting those gaps. The code is not impenetrable, it is simply very old. The most dangerous person to a dynasty is not a regulator. It is someone who mapped the code on a wall and is still alive, who knows the structure well enough to describe it accurately, and chose to publish rather than sell what they found. The regulatory battle is real, and it is not going well for the regulators. Every framework designed to expose dynasty ownership is met with a legal countermove already prepared. The code anticipated this. It wrote the legislation that limits the legislation. The referee was employed by the team. The technology hearing is theater. The dynasty understands this. The senators ask about algorithms. The real question is ownership. They never got around to asking that one. Artificial intelligence is cognitive encryption at machine speed. The model learns what the training data encodes. Who controls the training data controls the world's next epistemology. The dynasties did not miss this. They funded it first. The dynasties fund both the systems that create displacement and the organizations that manage it. The dynasties fund both the systems that create displacement and the organizations that manage it. This is not cynicism, it is structure. The code doesn't have an off switch for human suffering. It has a management protocol. When a currency collapses, it is not an accident. It is the resolution of a position that was entered years earlier. The dynasty exits before the crisis becomes visible. The public enters the queue on the day it has already ended. The treaty is the dynasty's trump card against democracy. If a government passes a law that costs a corporation profit, the corporation sues the government. The law is slow, but it accumulates precedent. This is the code written directly into international law. Development finance is the dynasty's most patient instrument. Development finance is the dynasty's most patient instrument. When you can't pay, they take the asset. The dynasties did not miss this. They funded it first. In 2026, the first major infrastructure cyber attack on a G7 nation was attributed to state actors. Every financial crisis is a wealth transfer. The public enters the queue on the day it has already ended. It was a partial map of the code. The dynasties have begun encoding themselves into the biological layer. On a Tuesday morning in 2023, 11 million documents left a law firm in Panama, and the world was not ready for what it saw. Some people reach the edge of the code and choose to transmit it. A central bank digital currency is not just a digital payment. The reporters who pursue dynasty structures work in the same operational posture as the people they investigate. The code anticipated this. It wrote the legislation that limits the legislation. They never got around to asking that one. You are not the customer. The public enters the queue on the day it has already ended. This is the code written directly into international law. They funded the research, they own the databases. The resource war is the dynasty's most expensive and most profitable instrument. The issuer can decide where it can be spent, when it expires, and what it cannot buy. The reconstruction is funded by the same capital that financed the conflict. And the resource flows, exactly as planned. The pandemic proved the code operates at biological scale. The pandemic proved the code operates at biological scale. It is an economic one. And the people who can't read the code begin to attack the infrastructure it runs on. The code generates the conditions of its own challenge. Not by governments, by private systems answering to private owners. The architecture of what you are allowed to know is managed in real time. The dynasty doesn't suppress alternatives, it purchases them at Series A. When the code appears in public, it activates its own immune system. In the growing number of people who can now name what they're living inside, the fracture spreads, one small legislature at a time. In the rooms where a professor shows a slide that changes how a room full of people see the world, censorship does not require a censor. This is the fracture entering the educational system, and it will not be removed. The story you believe about the world was seeded by someone who benefits from you believing it. The vote decides the face of government, not the ownership structure beneath it. The fracture is real. It appears in constitutional conventions. But a code that is beginning to be read is no longer fully secure. Part 4 is the question, what happens next? The dynasty doesn't suppress alternatives. It purchases them at Series A. New dynasties don't replace old ones. The new platform is the old encryption with a better interface. A legal review that never ends is functionally identical to a kill order. The code is being decoded, slowly, imperfectly, against fierce resistance. The regulation of artificial intelligence will determine cognitive sovereignty. Every governance framework that requires transparency was systematically weakened. Dark screens, no water, no heat. The code made visible through absence. Who controls the AI controls the next layer of the code. The most dangerous person to a dynasty is not a regulator. When you can't pay, they take the asset. Publication is the only act the code cannot undo. The code evolves when it is read. That is how you know it is alive. The jurisdictions that attempt to break the code are small. They are authorized by them. The editor knows, the journalist suspects, the public waits. The story sits in a drawer until the moment has passed. The code is being taught. Every tool built to break the code was eventually funded by those the code protects. Not the code itself, they still don't know what it is, but the walls that protect it. And the economic decision was made by those who own the medicine. When the code is entered into evidence, it loses something essential. Enough inequality, enough opacity, enough demonstrable injustice. The conflict creates the political conditions for the extraction contract. The code produces its own challengers and then acquires them. The dynasties discovered narrative encryption before the internet existed. But state actors are funded by dynasties. When you can't pay, they take the asset. Who controls the AI controls the next layer of the code. Democracy does not threaten the code. Not the code itself. They still don't know what it is, but the walls that protect it. And the economic decision was made by those who own the medicine. Enough inequality, enough opacity, enough demonstrable injustice. The fracture is real, it is small, it is growing. The conflict creates the political conditions for the extraction contract. The code produces its own challengers and then acquires them. But state actors are funded by dynasties. Not the code itself, they still don't know what it is, but the walls that protect it. And the economic decision was made by those who own the medicine. Enough inequality, enough opacity, enough demonstrable injustice. The conflict creates the political conditions for the extraction contract. Every system eventually generates the conditions of its own accountability. Not because its architects designed that in, but because every code has a limit. A threshold beyond which the gap between the encrypted world and the visible one becomes impossible to maintain. We are approaching that threshold. The prosecution of generational power requires generational patience. The evidence takes decades to gather because the encryption was designed to frustrate exactly this. But courts have memory, and the code left documents. Documents are the point at which encryption meets gravity. When the beneficial ownership database went live, the code was not broken, but it was translated for the first time into a language regulators could read. The dynasty adapted. It always adapts. But adaptation requires exposure, and exposure leaves a trail. Algorithmic transparency is the beginning of cognitive sovereignty. When the recommendation engine is auditable, the encryption weakens. Not eliminated, weakened. Every weakness in the code is a point where the world outside it gains leverage. Legislation is slow, but it is permanent. Every law that encodes transparency into the operating system of governance is a line rewritten. The dynasties will find the loophole, they always do. But the loophole is smaller than the original gap, each time. The most powerful act of resistance is readable. A generation that can trace the ownership of the information it receives cannot be fully encrypted. Not because they'll dismantle the code, but because they'll know it exists. And a known encryption is a negotiable one. The dynasties controlled jurisdictions because jurisdictions were national. A transnational court creates a jurisdiction the code cannot simply relocate away from. The process will take decades. The outcome is not guaranteed. But an institution once created carries institutional memory, and memory is the enemy of encryption. Decentralized finance is an imperfect tool, but imperfect tools change history. The dynasties are inside the system. They bought in early. But the system itself cannot be owned, only used. And use creates precedent. Precedent creates architecture. The investigative coalition is the dynasty's most durable adversary. Not because it is powerful, but because it is patient. The code was built over centuries. The people reading it have decided to match that patience. When a dynasty is partially exposed, it does not collapse. It pivots. The statement says everything except the thing you need to know. The assets are restructured before the subpoena arrives. The code is fluid. It flows around pressure and reassembles. When a country chooses to decode its own operating system, the code loses territory. Not globally, not permanently, but irrevocably locally. Every jurisdiction that maintains transparency becomes an island of legibility. Legibility spreads by example, even in a world designed to prevent it. When the cognitive encryption is brought into a public hearing, something changes. Not the system, but the conversation around it. Algorithmic nudges converging on a behavioral outcome. Cognitive sovereignty is the right to understand. The weight of what has been presented visible in posture and silence. Change is inevitable. The most powerful decoder of a code is someone born inside it. Who learned the language before they understood what it protected? The discipline of reading the code is now formal. It can be taught, it can be learned, it can be applied. This is the dynasty's structural vulnerability. Its people are human. Every generation that graduates with financial literacy is harder to encrypt. Not impossible, but harder. The code has always relied on the public not understanding the vocabulary. When the vocabulary is taught, the code must become more complex. When the vocabulary is taught, the code must become more complex. And complexity has costs. Voluntary transparency is not naive, it is strategic. The company that opens its code forces competitors to explain why theirs is closed. The market for trust is real. And when trust becomes a competitive advantage, the economics of the code begin to shift. The generation that grew up after the Panama Papers knows a word the previous one didn't: beneficial owner. That word is a key to a conversation that has never been fully public. And the conversation, once started, is impossible to fully stop. Cognitive sovereignty is the right to understand the system you live inside. It will not be won in a single summit. It will be contested for a generation. But the act of naming it, of putting it in a treaty, changes what is possible. The code can survive exposure. It cannot survive being named in law. The dynasty does not end when it is exposed. It merely adapts. It redesigns, rebuilding the code from within to withstand the pressure. The code that required centuries to build is rebuilt in months because the blueprint was never lost. The fight is not against a moment of exposure. It is against the continuity of the code. When the map is public, the code has not been broken, but it has been read. Reading is the prerequisite for rewriting. The map is incomplete, but essential. The map is incomplete, but an incomplete map is infinitely more useful than no map at all. But an incomplete map of an encrypted system is infinitely more useful than no map at all. Jurisdictions that chose transparency are measuring outcomes. Accountability produces better results. The cities that chose transparency are now the data against opacity. Material reality is shifting. The argument that accountability destroys value is being dismantled by the facts on the ground. The data from cities that chose differently is beginning to say something different. The media organization that publishes its ownership becomes the reference point for the ones that don't. Transparency is not just a value, it is a competitive framing device. When one outlet makes the code visible, every other outlet's silence speaks. The audience learns to hear the silence. When a sovereign wealth fund publishes its full portfolio, it changes the market's information environment. It changes what other funds must explain about their own silence. The code relies on universal opacity. Partial transparency breaks that. Asymmetry is information. A right once declared cannot be unrecognized. The dynasty can contest the implementation. It cannot remove the declaration from the record. The record is the second most powerful thing in the world. The first is the code that was never meant to be written down. The small corrections are not symbolic. They are architectural. Each renaming, each disclosure, each restructured donation changes the physical record. The dynasty's name in stone is the code inscribed in architecture. When the stone is changed, even one stone, the language of the building is different. When the code holder negotiates transparency, the code has not been broken, but it has agreed to a condition it has never accepted before. Negotiated legibility is not accountability, but it is a start toward it. But it is the beginning of a conversation that was never possible when the code was fully sealed. The discipline of reading the code is now formal. It can be taught, it can be learned, it can be applied. The discipline of reading the code is now formal. The dynasty built its encryption over centuries without an opposing discipline. That symmetry is finally ending as a new discipline takes root in the world. The era of the encrypted empire is closing. When the registry is public, the city becomes a different kind of text. The same streets, the same buildings, the same shops. But the authorship is now visible. And when you can see who wrote the city, you can begin to discuss whether you want to keep their version. And when you can see who wrote the city, you can begin to discuss whether you want to keep their version. The voluntary accounting is not an ending, it is a renegotiation. The voluntary accounting is not an ending, it is a renegotiation. The dynasty that discloses retains more than it appears to surrender. Because the act of disclosure changes the social contract. From one written in cipher to one written in a language both parties can read. The conversation is now formal, the architecture of a conversation that would have been impossible 10 years ago. It is contested, imperfect, and incomplete, but it is on the record in the language of governance for the first time. But it is on the record in the language of governance for the first time. And the record, as always, is the only thing the code truly fears. And the record, as always, is the only thing the code truly fears. The architecture of a new conversation. The code is not defeated in courts. It is not broken by leaks. It is not ended by summits. It is not broken by leaks. It is not ended by summits. It is decoded, slowly, imperfectly, one person at a time, by teaching people the vocabulary it was designed to prevent them from learning. The argument that accountability destroys value was always the code's primary defense. The cities that chose transparency are now the data against it. The cities that chose transparency are now the data against it. The defense is not defeated, but it is weakened. And every weakened defense is a wall that is shorter than it was. The architecture of the future is being built on accountability. When the private becomes public, the code loses a stronghold. Not all strongholds, not the core. It has been moved before, it will be moved again. The stronghold is opening, But the boundary between what can be owned privately and what must remain common is a line that can be moved. The grammar of ownership is being rewritten by the public will. The map is not the territory. Naming the code is not destroying it, but a named system is a system in negotiation. And negotiation is the beginning of the only kind of change that lasts. The code has governed the world for centuries. It will not be ended by a documentary. But every person who understands that a code exists is a node in the counter-architecture. A distributed system of awareness is the only structure that scales to match it. The dynasties built the world you live in. They encrypted the operating instructions. They depend on you not knowing how to read them. You are reading them now.